This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. To join our global community and access member-only webinars, events, a wide range of digital learning offerings, coaching and leadership resources, accreditation schemes, and more, you can find us at associationforcoaching.com. Hello, and welcome to this new series for the Association for Coaching. My name is George Warren. I'm thrilled to be back here hosting another series. And in this series, we're going to speak about the conscience and consciousness of coaching. So some very interesting and far-reaching conversations which look to the present and the future of coaching. So I get to speak to some fascinating writers and thinkers and neuroscientists and psychologists, as well as some coaches, where we explore some of the really big questions facing the coaching industry right now, and also explore how neuroscience can help us. So today I'm thrilled to be having a conversation with Dr. Chris Johnstone, who's a specialist in the psychology of resilience and sustainable happiness and positive change. It's a second conversation with Chris after our first interview in the Coaching in the Climate Crisis series. And today we widen it out even further to explore, of course, topics of resilience, but also upstream, downstream interventions. The new edition of his book, Active Hope with Joanna Macy, which for me is one of the most important books I've read in my life, as well as the what he terms spiritual science and the concept of psychological capital. Now, it being Chris, it's a chance for me to explore his thoughts and tips on what I think to be the most underrated and important skill to be learned and appreciated in coaching, which is systems thinking. So at a very broad level, Chris and I explore the role and impact that we as individuals can have in seeing ourselves and our own actions as part of a much wider community or system. It's a really beautiful conversation. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Chris. And if you enjoy this, please check out the previous conversation I had with Chris from the earlier series, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes for today. Here it is. Chris, welcome. Good to speak with you again. How are you doing?
Thanks, George. It's a real pleasure to be here talking with you for another conversation.
Yes, we had episode 47 of this series, a beautiful conversation, which I've gone back to many times. And I recommend our listeners who haven't to check that out, because it's quite a wonderful and I think a very informative conversation about, especially, we go deep into your work around resilience, but also we look through the lens of the climate crisis and what coaches and those who coach and those who are coached can do. So for those that haven't listened to that episode, would it be helpful for you to share a bit about the work that you do?
Sure. I wear different hats, probably like many people listening. I see myself primarily as a resilient specialist and trainer. I work with individuals, with groups, with organizations around looking at what helps us face difficult situations and respond in ways that support resilience and well-being. And by background, my first degree was a combined degree in medicine and psychology, and then I trained as a medical doctor and worked in mental health for many years with people with serious addiction problems, alcohol dependence, and also became very interested in motivational interviewing and seeing that really as an approach to coaching. Got very interested in well-being coaching, and my journey really was seeing how relevant so much of what I was doing in the addictions field is, and teaching some of that in other settings too, in adult education, in workplace well-being training, and also in my one-to-one coaching work as well. I have also worked for over 30 years now with US author, activist, teacher of world religions, Joanna Macy, and we co-wrote a book, Active Hope, which we've just brought out a second edition of. And Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power, is the new subtitle. And so my work with her has really been around workshops that support people in facing crisis in the world and finding their part to play. But it's more than that. It's Joanna developed an approach called the work that reconnects, which is really about plugging into life, feeling ourselves as part of life rather than separate from life. And so she developed, with others too, what she calls the spiral. It's a journey through gratitude, honouring our pain for the world, seeing with new eyes and going forth. It's a journey that draws on spiritual practices and traditions, but also depth psychology and narrative structures in taking people through a transformative process that strengthens their capacity to face the mess we're in and find their part to play.
I'm glad you mentioned that work, because it's a work I'm very familiar with, and it's how I first came across the work that you and Joanna have done. And it's a model that I've gone back to many, many times, and I've recommended even more times as well. So yeah, it's a fantastic thing. I'm very grateful for.
Me too.
And well, you mentioned a sense of the spiritual there, and it's one of the things I'd really love to speak with you about is the place of spirituality in coaching, in modern coaching, and more broadly the workplace. And the reason I ask, my own journey has been starting off as a coach, very nervous to explore and broaden the conversation far enough out, or deepen the conversation to a sense of my clients' core beliefs and a sense of purpose and what they believe to be true about our very existence. And I just admire in such an elegant way how your work and your collaborations have made it okay to explore the spiritual in your clients. And I'm just wondering how important you believe a conversation around spirituality to be in the workplace broadly, or in the coaching conversations these days.
Yes, and it's so interesting because that word spirituality, it will ring different bells or have different associations with different people. And you can use words that mean the same thing that people would probably, even if they didn't have any particular strong religious or spiritual beliefs as they might see it in one level, would completely go along with. So, for example, if you said something like, is your life rooted in something bigger than yourself? For example, your family or causes that are important to you. You know, it would be quite straightforward to say yes to something like that. And if you talked something about, in coaching, you know, is it relevant to talk about feelings of concern for your family? Is it relevant to talk about feelings of loyalty to a team that you're part of? Those seem to be, of course, you know, of course would be that would be likely be a response. And so spirituality is a lot to do with, exactly as you were saying when you were talking about exploring with people deeper values and purposes. If you want people to be motivated, if you want people to find their motivation, and particularly this idea of intrinsic motivation, which is more rooted in our heart, our kind of inner sense of what feels right, what feels important, that seemed to be tremendously important in the workplace. And spirituality is really about exploring a larger framing of those deeper values and purposes that are absolutely bread and butter to most coaching processes.
Sometimes I reflect that what might be called performance coaching, helping a client serve the problem they're presenting, can be a bit too superficial and doesn't address some deeper root causes or sometimes unsurfaced blockers or issues that might need to be addressed in order to grow resilience, get the sort of more profound sense of success or satisfaction or achievement that a client might bring. And I'm wondering, I know a lot of your work has been in the field of resilience, and I'm wondering if you could say a few words about how you understand the relationship between spirituality and resilience.
Yes. Really great question. And firstly, just in terms of scientific evidence, spiritual sources of strength are an evidence-based factor in resilience. When they've done studies of people going through very difficult times, for example, they've done studies of prisoners of war, people in hospital facing major illnesses, people recovering from surgery. For example, I think in women who've fallen and broken their hip, they tend to get up on their feet and be out of hospital more quickly and use less painkillers if they say yes or strongly to the question, do you identify a spiritual source of strength? And so just in terms of what science research has shown strengthens resilience, spiritual sources of strength are up there in recognised resilience factors. But there's more than that as well, because you're talking about performance coaching, and the idea that coaching is good if it strengthens performance. And I think there's one of the insights in resilience training that people find really useful is that there's a difference between maximum performance and optimum performance. So, for example, if you're running a marathon, do you want maximum speed or optimum speed? And there's an issue here which is centrally about sustainability. Sustainability is really what can be sustained. You know, you can sprint very quickly, but you won't be able to sustain that pace if you're running a marathon. And unless you have pauses for renewal along the way, you can do dashes and pause for recovery, dash and pause for recovery. But in terms of workplace resilience, one of the big factors is stress and overload. And for people to really get that difference between maximum speed and optimum speed is a breakthrough moment for some people. It's like, I'd never really got that, because sometimes we can be in work pressures, work contexts where there's such a drive to go faster and faster. But also those may also be organisations that have a high cost of staff sickness, high turnover of staff, high levels of sickness absence, and also there's the sense of when you've got turnover, you know, people spend years developing expertise in a role, and when they leave, it's expensive for an organisation to replace them. And so this idea of optimum is partly it's what can be sustained, but it's also what brings out our best. When you're dashing, do you have your best attention? When you're driving very quickly, are you a safer driver? So again, with driving, you know, there's a parallel there. What's an optimum speed? What's a maximum speed? And in a way, this really comes down to our whole culture, because with performance coaching and also performance as a high value in organizations, do we want an organization or an economy or a country or a society that goes for this maximum, but in a way that you get this system dynamic of overshoot and collapse. Overshoot is when you go too far for too long in a way that erodes the carrying capacity of that system, in a way it pushes too far, in a way that can lead to some kind of breakdown. And that's exactly what we're experiencing with the climate breakdown, the breakdown in agriculture that's happening in Europe at the moment, with severe droughts and likely continuing droughts, and a combination of droughts and also extreme heat drying out the land, making wildfires much greater risk. This is not optimum by any means. And when we look at what's the kind of life we want, what's the kind of society we want, what kind of life do we want, what kind of work do you want, these are core coaching questions. It's really about it's helping people reflect on choices, helping people look ahead at the options available to them and say, which one draws you most strongly here? And also what supports what you want. Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about the scenario of somebody being incredibly successful, but in the wrong direction. And, you can make great progress, but in the wrong direction. And that's where we are. That's what we're landing at. And it's why the coaching profession is so well placed, because coaching, I think of coaching as navigational support. So that's what I say to my coaching clients, to say that this is a space for navigational support. You can look at the direction you're heading in, the kind of choices available to you, and reflect on which way do you want to go and what will help you move in that direction.
As I reflect, we've beautifully zoomed out from the individual via the team, organization, society to the planetary. And you mentioned the phrase systemic there and what systems think. I know that's something you're very passionate about. I'm wondering, for those coaches listening who are interested in incorporating the systemic lens into their coaching and experimenting, I'm wondering what resources or encouragement you'd like to share to those that are curious about it.
Yes, I think one really interesting thing is just to reflect on how you are when you're by yourself, and then reflect on how you are when you're in a group. And not just in a group, but how you are in different groups. And I know that when I'm by myself, I've got different aspects of myself. I have different sides of myself that come out. But there are some sides of myself that just jump out of nowhere when I'm in the right social context. That I have a kind of playful musical side of me that surprises other people and myself when I'm in the right group setting where that, there's room for that. I also have a side of me that is evoked by particular group situations. I spent years and years working as a group therapist in the health service, and working with groups, there's a kind of level of attentiveness to what's going on. It kind of wakes me up because, so this role as a group facilitator, I pay attention to what's going on with group energy. And there's a whole level of my being that kind of comes into play that I don't experience when I'm by myself, and I don't experience just when I'm in a conversation with someone else. And so what I'm giving an example there is that we're more than one thing, and we can think of our individual self, but we can also think of our connected self. Our connected self is where we're part of rather than apart from. And what's different about that is that there's a larger story of what's going on. It's not just this is a story about me. This is a story about us, and I play a role in that. And so this is really what systems thinking is about, is wherever you've got an us, that's a defined entity that's made up of smaller entities. That's what we mean by a system. And systems behave in particular ways that are completely fascinating. And you talked about telescoping from, individual, team, organisation, society. What systems thinking does is it sees the world in layers rather than in pieces. If you look at the world in pieces, you kind of put a little boundary around each piece and say, let's look at this by itself. And a lot of our conventional education and science is based on that, is dividing the world into different departments. You can have a university where you get one part of the world being studied in one building and another part being studied in another building, and even like plants and animals, completely different aspects of biology. Systems thinking is based on the idea that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, that you can know everything about an insect and you can know everything about a plant, but when you bring them together, you get a larger story of interaction, in the same way that when you bring, me in a group, there's a larger story of interaction. And so systems thinking is saying that to understand reality, you want to look at these wholes and see how they're different from just a collection of little pieces. You can have a pile of cells, and that's different from what happens when you have an organ. You can have a pile of organs, and that's different from what happens with a whole person. You can get a number of separate people, and that's different from what happens, say, within a group or a family or an organization. And so systems theory, systems thinking, seeing the world in layers, is also looking at common patterns of activity that you can see at different layers. And so one pattern of activity is self-regulation. So, for example, I live in the north of Scotland, and even though a lot of people are experiencing a heat wave at the moment, up here the temperature's lower and I've got a jersey on. But talking with you is quite an active process, and after a while I might feel I'm getting a bit hot here and I'll take my jersey off. That's thermoregulation. But you can have a group of people sitting in a room together, and you might have somebody there who's more sensitive to hotness, and who might say, oh, it's a bit hot in here, shall I open a window? And it's as though the group is acting through people to control the temperature in the room. It's like the group will have its own comfortable norm of temperature, and if it gets too hot, somebody might open a window. If it gets too cold, somebody might close a window or switch a heater on. But also you get that in a termite's nest as well. Termites have this incredibly advanced system of thermoregulation, temperature control, where they have all these tunnels through a termite's nest, and when it's hot, the termites lie flat near the door, the entrances to the nest, so that air can pass through. But if it's cold, what they'll do is they'll bunch up and block the doors to stop the flow of air through the termite's nest to keep the heat in. And what systems thinking looks at is, how do you recognize that self-regulation tendency as happening at lots of different levels? And one of the big breakthroughs of science really over the last few decades has been Gaia theory. And Gaia theory is the idea that you can look at the whole planet, not just the life forms, but the life forms and the physical substance acting together as like a super organism. That there are ways in which we think that over the time that life has been on Earth, the sun has got perhaps 25% hotter, yet our temperature hasn't on planet Earth. And life has played an active role, maybe that's a question. It's played a role anyway in regulating temperature on planet Earth. That, for example, forests, trees release these tiny little chemical compounds that help clouds form. And algae in the ocean also play a role in cloud formation in a way that reflects some of the light away from the planet in a way that protects it from overheating. I think this is just completely fascinating. It's not nearly as widely known as it needs to be, but it also relates very strongly to some of the questions you're interested in talking about what do we mean by consciousness? Because you can see thinking processes happening in systems, not just individuals. It's like a group. A group can have a mood. A team can have a mood. You can have collective intelligence within an organization. One of the terms around in resilience training is psychological capital. Psychological capital refers to the wealth of resources of psychological understanding within an organization that can have a protective effect in terms of dealing with stress and dealing particularly with difficult issues like conflicts. If it's got a high level of psychological intelligence, it can navigate more skillfully through some of the human challenges the organisation might face.
It's fascinating stuff, Chris. And what's surfacing for me hearing you speak is in relation to coaching, there seems a very clear link between this sort of sensitivity that a team coach might have in exploring the unconscious and the interactions among a team, and a facilitator as well. And it seems that little bit harder for a coach coaching someone one-on-one to bring in that collective business or even team exploration of those layers. And I'm wondering if there are any tips or experiences or resources that you might want to share with our listeners who are interested in widening out the perspective in their coaching?
Yes. So one of the books that many coaches may be aware of is Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. And there's a group of people who've been involved in organisational development, working with teams, who've really done a lot to bring systemic practice into the mainstream. And certainly that was a very big influence on me, his work, Peter Senge. And there's lots of others who've followed him. But just in terms of resources, I would say that one of the most available resources is just to reflect on your own experience, and also just to be curious about for example, the question, what do I belong to? What do I feel part of? And just this idea that, coming back to this idea of I have a separate self, that's me, and then what am I part of? And so whenever you think, well, what am I part of? My name, for example, Chris Johnstone. The Chris refers to me as a separate individual, but Johnstone is a family name, and it refers to a system that I am part of. And we can all do this. We can think, that's interesting. I've got these different sides. There's the Chris side and there's the Johnstone side. So what am I part of? Okay, I'm part of a family. And then you might think, well, what does that mean to me? What does it mean to me to be part of a family? What kinds of ways does it influence my experience? So one of the things I feel is belonging. I also feel loyalty. I also feel commitment. And there's times also when there's, as I'm currently experiencing sort of health challenges in my family, elderly parent, there's some kind of sometimes concern comes up as well. And so there's a whole layer of my existence that's more than just me as a separate individual. It's me as a member of a system. But then I could go further. I could say, well, what else? What else do I belong to? What teams am I part of? And whenever there's a team, there's a group of people who are gathered around a shared purpose. And also with that come perhaps expectations or obligations. And you might think, or a useful area to explore is, well, how does that affect me? What ways do I behave differently, or what does it bring out in me? So this is a question, okay, what am I part of? What do I belong to? But another question to explore, and so we're talking about resources, and the resource I'm pointing you to here are questions, simple questions that we can reflect on. So one is, what am I part of? What do I belong to? Another is, well, who are you? I can look at you, George, and say, George, tell me, who are you? And you feel welcome to answer. And just to warn you, whatever you say, I'm going to come back to you with the same question. Do you want to play this game now, the Tell Me Who You Are game? Just to try it out as an experiment.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. It's one I'm familiar with, and I teach on one of the coaching courses.
And it's so interesting that this is something you're familiar with and you use. And when you teach with it, what happens? What do you find with that?
I had it done to me. I took part in it before I taught it. So if I reflect on my own experience, which mirrors my broad experience of teaching it, there's something about the labels and how we present ourselves, especially in a new learning group when we're feeling a bit self-conscious or keen to promote certain aspects of ourselves. So I noticed myself keen to convey a sense of legitimacy. And so I talked about my job title and was keen to emphasize my experience and all the responsibilities I have at work. And I talked about that for a little while, and then spoke about my family and my role as a son and as a brother and as a partner. And after being played out several rounds and being told I couldn't repeat anything from previous rounds, I noticed it was more about, we moved more into values and what I believe to be true and what is important to me, and some of my characteristics that have made me the personality and the person that I am.
Really interesting. And when you find that you're teaching with this question and encouraging people on courses to reflect on this question, who are you? And coming back to the same question again and again a number of times.
Well, the really interesting thing is, and I love the link to the systemic, which I hadn't really looked at, is that you hear folks talking about, I'm a captain of a hockey and or netball team. I'm part of a rowing community. I'm part of a running club. I'm part of a wild swimming group. We meet every Tuesday and go for a swim in the sea. And the thing as a coach, I really love exploring is you might find a client presenting a lack of confidence about a presentation or a conversation or a meeting they're about to have. And they say, well, I just don't have any confidence. And the thing I love about the systemic approach is that you could explore these other groups that they are a part of. And okay, so tell me about a time when you've been confident as part of your wild swimming group, swimming in the sea in a January morning, in the dark, in the rain. And there seems to be different pools of resource that can be explored, and zooming out and exploring the different parts of the individual, different parts of the psyche, you can dip into those resources to help clients with their presenting problems that might be specific to their work or their career.
It's really great. I also use this question, tell me who you are. And it's something that we wrote about in Active Hope and invite people to do as a practice. And you can do it just by getting a bit of paper and having the question at the top saying, tell me who you are. And then see if you can write a different answer on every line as you go down the page and fill a whole page or even more than one page. But you can also do it in dialogue where you have people in pairs and maybe do 5 minutes each way of one person just asking the same question, tell me who you are, who are you, who are you? And then one person just replying and replying again and again. And my experience of doing that is that, yeah, there's all these different aspects of us. And exactly as you're saying, George, so many of them are rooted in groups or social contexts where we share something with others. And I think of it as like a root system that we can draw strength from. And what made me particularly aware of this was I worked for years in mental health with people struggling with addictions recovery. And I remember one person saying, he said, he came in on the Monday and he'd been through a really difficult weekend. And I was really impressed. And I said, like, how come you got through this weekend without drinking? And he said, well, I thought of the group and it gave me strength. And so when we're looking at how we find strength to take on challenges, and this links to resilience too, just being aware of the groups that we're part of, and it sounds similar, perhaps using a slightly different way to the way you've worked with people, is that you're helping people tap into a source of strength. And one person who really reminded me of this was Peter Shaw. Peter Shaw was somebody who was kidnapped in Georgia in Eastern Europe and held for months and months in a underground, tiny room with no light. And one of the things that he did to kind of help himself through that horribly difficult time was that he used to think of someone who'd been important to him and take a different person each day. And then he'd spend the whole day reflecting on times he'd spent with them and composing a speech that he'd give. And at the end of the day, he'd give the speech. And sometimes he'd actually hear them speak back to him. I mean, he was held in sensory and social deprivation. But what he'd done was he'd remembered his root system and he'd drawn strength from it. And I think this is crucial for resilience, but it's also crucial in terms of this sense of what are we? You know, what are we? We're not just separate individuals. We're also part of larger flows of human activity. And I say this word flows. Another word might be stories and another word might be systems. But I think flows is a useful word because a flow implies something that's in movement, and what it moves is through time. And so, for example, a team, you know, you can have a team that's been in the same place doing the same purpose for decades, but the people within it, they come and they go. And so you have a flow of people, even though the team may have a kind of maintaining itself. And so that's an example of looking at a kind of systems level where you're saying, there's an entity here which has an existence even though the people in it are just part of a flow. I don't know, how's this sounding to you, George?
Sounding really right and inspiring. And all of those words, flow, especially, it's connecting with me, Chris.
And I'm so interested in that word inspiring, because inspiring is also, I think, of as a flow. And I wonder what's the inspiration you're picking up on, or that's flowing through you, perhaps, or if that's okay to not be too nosy to ask.
No. Well, I think a good coach is okay being a bit nosy and asking questions that others might not. So all welcome, Chris. So what came up for me hearing you speak was a reflection that I've heard leveled at coaching, and I've also heard leveled at, particularly Western psychotherapy, in that there is something of an individualism to it and a focus or bias towards the individual at the cost of the wider community or system or team. And I just felt a burst of energy and a sense that the systemic and broadening the inquiry out toward the more parts and more individuals and people within that system is just somewhere very exciting, and somewhere I imagine coaching will continue to mature and evolve into. And so that was my energy and reflection. And
yes,
I'm wondering if that's inspired anything for you.
Yes, and it's interesting because what I'm experiencing is resonance, and resonance, I think, like on a piano where you get one string hit with the hammer, and the neighbouring strings have a kind of sympathetic resonance. They kind of vibrate along with it. So I'm feeling that within me, my kind of self. Also, it's interesting, inspiration can kind of bounce between people and have a kind of resonance, because exactly what you've just said there, that there's a very vital and important cultural current that is refreshing and like a breath of fresh air in the systemic perspective, because it counters what has been, I think, an unhelpful extreme view that can sometimes be seen in the kind of Western culture more generally. And this idea that somehow, what else is there apart from me? And it relates a lot to issues like climate change. Something I've heard recently is when climate change comes up as an issue, people saying things like, well, what's it got to do with me? I'll probably be dead by the time it gets really bad. And just this idea that somehow things don't matter if they happen after we've died. Now, actually, I don't think that's how most people feel. In fact, I know it's not. But it is there as a kind of idea around that's spoken, what's the point of worrying about this? I won't be alive then anymore. And this is where spirituality is really so rooted to resilience, because if you have individual resilience, it's a bit like, say, within a larger body, a group of cells thinking we can be very strong, but being completely uninterested if the body is dying. That's just a complete nonsense, that you can have super healthy cells in a dying body. Like, really, it's not going to last very long, because there's a dependence of and a interdependence between different layers of a system. And it's the same with us too, to have a successful species but a dying environment that they're in. Is the successful species is not going to succeed for very long. There's a interdependence, and interdependence is where we can play a role contributing to an environment while also being dependent on it. So your glow of inspiration at this current of systemic thinking, I actually think that it's a lifeline. It's a lifeline in our culture, and it's what the work that reconnects is also deeply rooted in, because there's a kind of, if we talk about a toxic thought, a toxic thought is a thought with harmful impact. The toxic thought is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I do, or it doesn't matter what I do. And that toxic thought can work both ways. It can work in ways where we don't really pay attention to what potential harm we might cause. We say, what does it matter? It's not going to do much. If I pollute, or if I behave in a way that's going to cause harm elsewhere in time or space. That idea that it doesn't matter, but also it can be harmful when we think that the actions we take when we are concerned won't make any difference. We can say, what's the point? What's the point of doing that? It won't make any difference. It won't really change things. And actually, that's the same toxic belief. It's the same toxic belief that we don't have an impact. And one way of framing that belief is, you can't change the world. And if that was really true, if it was really true that we couldn't change the world, we wouldn't have climate change. We wouldn't have the mass extinction event that's happening at the moment. We wouldn't be having the massive plague of mega fires that's happening in so many different parts of our world at the moment, and the disruption of agriculture that's linked to rain-fed agriculture is under threat and already being disrupted in parts of our world. So we wouldn't have that if we couldn't change the world. And this thing about consciousness is, do we have a consciousness that's based on this toxic belief that we're separate and what we do doesn't matter? Or do we have a consciousness of connection, of belonging, of feeling deeply part of and loyal to our world in a way where we want to show up and play our part in acting for its well-being?
It's a beautiful sentiment.
I love that word, beautiful. And Arne Næss, the Norwegian deep ecologist, he wrote about the idea of a beautiful life. A beautiful life is one that's good for the individual and also good for the world. And I'd say that that's the challenge we have. And I'm very interested in also happiness and our approach to happiness. And I'm developing a training called Suha training. Suha training is training in Suha, which is sustainable happiness. And just as you can have yoga or Tai Chi as well-being practices, I think of Suha as like a new well-being practice that is rooted in this systemic sentiment that we're part of something larger. And Unsuha, unsustainable happiness, is where your actions in a moment steal happiness from somewhere else in time and space. And a great example of that is if you drink heavily in an evening and have a hangover the next day. It's a bit like your joy in an evening robs it from the next morning. And many people can recognise that. And it's the same with so many short-term pleasures that cause long-term harm, that they're unsuha. And it's recognising that there's, whatever we do, there's short-term impact and long-term impact. And if something is pleasurable in the short term but harmful in the long term, my background as an addiction specialist here is that's what I was dealing with all the time. Behaviours that are very attractive in the short term, but the problem is that they create harm in the long term. And in a way, that's what we have in our whole culture, the unsuha, unsustainable happiness. But if we think of, okay, there's impact and there's negative impact, harmful impact, but there can also be positive impact. And how can you have joy in a moment that also sends out ripples of well-being that bring benefit elsewhere in time and space? And that's what Arne Næss means by the beautiful life. The beautiful life is where what you do, you can have experience benefits yourself, but there are also ripples of benefit that extend beyond yourself.
Well, I'm very glad I chose the word beautiful to hear that, Chris. Thank you. And there's a link to me appearing between what we spoke about earlier in this conversation about something of a short-termism when a business is looking at profits, quarterly profits, or kicking the can down the road, or even us in any society not really understanding the true cost of, for example, that very cheap flight that we might be taking, there is a hidden cost which is not factored in there. And there's a sense of short-termism coming up for me in a lot of the business practices. And we as coaches might be, I use the phrase colluding with, but reinforcing and perpetuating some of those unhealthy short-term business practices. And there's something coming up for me around the skill of a coach to look at the different layers, but also have the confidence and vision to look very, very far forward in time with their client, and also perhaps look very, very far backwards in time as well to create new awareness for their clients.
Yes, and there are examples of this that you can point to that people will clearly recognise in hindsight. And for example, Barings Bank, any of the kind of major financial scandals, Enron, so many of these others. And if you look at what's going on, you've got a behaviour that in the short term has benefits, but in the long term has costs, and particularly dishonesty. Dishonesty can seem like a quick fix, but what dishonesty does is it creates an obstacle to dealing with problems, because it's very difficult to deal with problems when there's so many lies around them that you don't actually know what you're dealing with. And this is why organisations that have strong integrity, and there's a kind of organisational integrity index, that they tend to have more durability. There was a study done, I remember reading, around organisations with high integrity, when they have this kind of integrity index, that they tend to be more resilient to times of fluctuation. And because it's difficult to navigate if you can't really trust the information on which you're basing your decisions. And so trust and honesty, which are really about values and kind of things that a coach might help somebody at least be honest with themselves. That if you're really aware that you're alongside a client who is pulling the wool over their own eyes, you're not serving that client if you're colluding with that. And then again, if you're working in support of an organisation, how is that different from not wanting to collude with an individual client who's pulling the wool over their eyes? If an organisation is pulling the wool over its eyes, if it's got a mismatch between its bold statements of intent and actually what it's doing, that actually help an organisation own its own discrepancies, actually helps the health of an organisation.
And part of my inquiry with this podcast series is into a sense of consciousness in the coaching space, but also conscience. And I feel that our conversation has rather beautifully stepped into that space. And I wanted to give some space to hear your thoughts on whether at an individual level or if we look at the coaching industry itself, where would you like to see the sense of conscience grow and flex its muscles more strongly and more vocally, Chris?
I think one of the most important questions is what do I serve? What do I serve? What does an organisation serve? What is it about? And in a way, this is something about recognising that if you're an individual and you recognise that you are hooked on something that is deeply damaging to things you hold dear, like the most important things, you might, if you're being coached, you might appreciate the coach being willing to help you face and work with the addictive, harmful behaviour. Now, I actually feel there's such strong parallels to the organisational behaviour that is so focused on maximising short-term economic gain that it acts as if it is addicted to that in a way that it will continue to pursue that goal even when it knows it's causing harm. And I think that the conscience and consciousness, so consciousness is really about an ability to reflect on what's happening and make choices on that. And unconsciousness is where there's a kind of blindness to what's going on. And so an inability to really make navigational choices that support the deeper goals of well-being. So just for example, many grandparents have money invested because they want to support the well-being of their grandchildren. But if that money invested is in organisations that are pumping millions and millions of pounds or dollars to fund lobby groups that lie about climate change and try and block action on climate change. And, this is a real scenario. This is happening. Lots and lots of grandparents have money invested in, for example, fossil fuel industries that have spent and are spending huge amounts of money on blocking climate action. Are they really helping their grandchildren? And if you were coaching somebody on, for example, investment coaching, helping somebody become conscious of their choices, conscious, like aware of and able to make choices that actually head in the direction that they most want, then this question of, I said the question, who do you serve? You could say, what does that money serve? What does that money serve? Does it really serve the intention of supporting the grandchildren? Or does it threaten their grandchildren? And in the same way in addictive behaviour is where somebody's doing something because they want to get some personal benefit, but it's a bit like they get the benefit in the short term, but at a price that just grows and grows in the longer term. And it's a bit like they deal with a problem, but the problem goes, but it comes back with interest, and you get a vicious spiral. The problem goes and it comes back with interest. And my perspective as someone who worked in the addictions field for many years is like I see there's a very similar pattern happening. So this question, okay, what do you serve? And what do you serve is like, well, who do you serve? Because there's issues here about loyalty. Are you being a good employee if you were at Enron and you went along with something that you knew was deeply wrong? You knew that the kind of behaviour that people were locked in was heading for a crash. Who do you serve? What do you serve? Are you serving the organisation by being complicit in that? Or there's a role here in organisational development called the positive disturber. And the positive disturber is someone who challenges a dysfunctional pattern in a way that may not be hugely popular at the time, but is actually deeply beneficial for the well-being of the organisation. And what we need is to hold ourselves to account in here and say, well, who do we serve? What are we serving? Are we reinforcing this short-term attachment to a financial balance sheet that actually is hiding costs because it doesn't really consider things beyond the short accounting period that it counts? Or are we, and there's lots of examples of it where, for example, BP, when it was trying to save money in its cost cutting in oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico, and in those oil wells where you might save in the short term, but in a way that's hugely expensive for an organisation in the long term. And that's really the situation that many people are finding themselves in. It's like, okay, well, what do I serve here? Do I really serve the larger story of life and my grandchildren or nieces and nephews, the next generations coming, whether or not I have children of my own, that we all have a role in supporting the next generation to kind of come in and the generations that follow that? Or do we remain hooked on some very short-term measure of progress that is at the expense of much, much greater, larger harm.
And what would you like to say to any folks listening who are involved in coach training or buyers of coaching, or any members of the accrediting bodies, be they the AC or any of the international bodies? What encouragement would you like to pass on to the members of the coaching industry who are listening?
So I think there's a number of steps here. So one of the steps is that actually it's very common for people to feel deeply troubled by this. And when people are deeply troubled by what's happening in the world, where's the space to reflect on that in a way where they might find their own conscious and consciousness that is connected with life and with their deeper values, rather than a sense of what might seem to be a kind of corporate norm that they're expected to go along with. And because how do organisations change unless the people within them change? And coaches, so one of the things is, well, how do we learn about how to support people to reflect on things that are outside the kind of mainstream business as usual framework of conversations? For example, I've been involved in teaching approach motivational interviewing, which is particularly helpful to bring into view ambivalence, where people have mixed feelings, that part of them might want this, part of them might want that. And then also the work around active hope, where some of the areas of conversation that are seen to be taboo, this idea that to actually explore our fears for the future, some people say things like, oh, well, that's too depressing, I just don't want to go there. But if coaches have the confidence to hold space for courageous conversations where we can look at our fears and hold a space and share practices that help us steady ourselves and feel our pain for the world, but also be appropriately shaken and stirred by it, so that we can find our motivation to play our role. And there's something here also about being able to not collude with the toxic limiting assumptions like we can't change the world. To recognise that we have and are changing the world, but we also need to apply our conscience and consciousness to how we're changing it, so that we can be changing it in a direction we feel good about rather than one that gives us nightmares. I think that the question you're raising, George, is such an important one, because I think this is, I think what I probably most do is recognise that there's a piece of work here that is an ongoing project. And I call it Project Active Hope. Project Active Hope is where we recognise that facing the mess we're in is hard. And sometimes we can feel defeated or overwhelmed or just kind of like so completely devastated and heart sunk that we just want to turn away from it. But if we take on the project of supporting ourselves and each other to find and play our part, we take it on as a project. We take on the project of identifying what we really hope for as we look into the future, the hopes that are supportable, and then also looking at how we support them, how we play an active role in making our hopes more lightly, heading in their direction. Even the hopes that feel out of reach, if we can head even a quarter of the way there, I hope we can bring an end to the mass extinction event that is currently underway. And I know that's a much bigger task than I can do. And rather than say, oh, I can't do that, I can say, well, can I make it more lightly? Can I head in that direction? And a question that helps here is, what am I part of? If I come back to that question, what am I part of? Am I part of a larger industrial society that is wrecking our world? Yes, lots of ways that I am part of that. But am I also part of a stirring of life that wants to continue? Am I part of a turning point? Am I part of a larger movement of turning up to play my part in this time of great danger and threat to so much of what we value in life on Earth?
I'm so grateful for your answer to that question, Chris, and grateful for you joining me in today's courageous conversation as well. I feel stirred and energized and inspired by, and really, really motivated and excited by what you answered there to that last question.
Good. Well, I feel really with you, George. And what I see you doing is you're like a explorer and also a pathfinder. And it's like, first of all, you're aware of the need. You know, we can't carry on the way we've been going. It's taking us over the edge of a cliff. We need to search out different pathways, different ways of working. And so what you're doing is you're seeking out people to have conversations with, but you're also encouraging a larger process of exploration and kind of questioning within the whole profession of coaches, but not just the profession of coaches, because coaches are also alongside people at all kinds of different levels in organisations. But this idea that every one of us can play a role of influence in whatever we belong to. And so it's like, okay, how do we change the story that happens through us? How do we play a role so that we invite in more the kind of story of what we'd like to see happen? And so I love what you're doing. Just one thing about coaching, and I work with a model I think of as the me, you and us model, and I work a lot with well-being and my training work around well-being, and so I work with the me, you and us model of well-being, where me is about, well, what about me? What about me here? And I think all coaches need to have that framing too. You know, how is it for ourselves as we face the mess we're in, as we try and navigate our way through this? And then you is where you're in support of someone else, and it might be a coaching client, but it might also be a friend or a colleague or a member of your family. And then us is really about the larger story. It's about, might be us as a team, or us as you and someone you're in loving relationship with. Us might be you and your family. And the thing about families is families have much longer lives than we do as individuals. You know, that we're part of families that are hundreds or more, perhaps even thousands of years old, because they go beyond what we can see. But as well as the roots of our family, and a lot of interest in family history, what would it be like also to think of the shoots of a family? If we were to be as interested in family future as we were in family history, and then say, okay, if I'm really interested in family future, or not just family future, it might be the place you live, your locality, your bioregion, that might be interested in its history, but also what would its future look like? And it's a future that's under threat. And what can we do here now so that one day perhaps people might look back on us as their ancestors and be grateful for what we did rather than be wrecked by it?
I'm glad you added that section or that offer there, Chris. It's again, I've got a sense of that sort of wider perspective, the viewing of a much longer timeline. And thinking about the legacy that we're leaving, both at an individual and familial level, but also any sort of organizational legacy as well. And that's a very helpful consideration that to bring into coaching conversations or even prospective coaching conversations is, and I think we touched on it in our last conversation around, you know, what do you want your business to be looking like and feeling like in 20 years? What are you going to need to do to flourish?
Yes, and there's something here about what do you want to become? That you know, that this idea of we are as we are, and there's acceptance, but there's also commitments to directions we want to move in. What is it you want to become? What is the direction you want to move in? And that's such a core stream of coaching conversation. And what we're looking at here is bringing in a stream of reality. We're saying, yeah, we're kind of opening our eyes and looking around us and taking in certain facts of where we are in time and space, where we are in our history, and recognizing that the choices we make will influence and shape the kind of direction we go in. So what do we want to become? And in particular, there's something here about what's the part in the story that we want to play. And in Active Hope, we write about 3 story patterns we can see happening. And one is business as usual, which is we just carry on the same old way. And I think that what really helps is to recognize how the same old way is locked into a pattern of overshoot and collapse. Overshoot where it's exerting a greater pressure on resources and also putting out toxic waste in a way that's harming the system that we all depend on, in a way that creates a likelihood of collapse. And there's already aspects of collapse that are happening, certainly aspects of collapse in ecological systems, social systems and climate systems. So there's a business as usual. Then there's another story which is think about as the great unravelling, and it's this idea that just things are just all falling apart, the world's going downhill and in decline. And actually surprising how many people think that when surveys have been done asking people whether they think the world conditions are getting worse or better, very significant majority of people think things are getting worse. But also in a way that can lead to a kind of resignation, a sense of, well, what can we do about it anyway? But then also another story is a story of crisis can become turning point, a story of people rising to the occasion, finding and playing their part. And we think of that as the story of the great turning. And really central in the great turning is just simply turning up with an intention to play our part. And turning up also recognising that there's things we need to turn away from that which causes harm, and turn towards that which supports the flourishing of life. And so in coaching, that question, what do you want to become, is also what do you want to turn towards? What do you want to turn away from? Both as an individual, you can do it, me, you and us, us as coaches. What in our practice do we want to turn away from? What do we want to turn towards? How can we turn towards being more conscious coaches who play a role in the larger story of what's going on in the world that we feel good about? We feel, yeah, this is really contributing to movement in a direction I have my heart in, but also turning away from being in collusion with something that might be causing harm. So the me, you and us, okay, how do I turn up? But the you is how do I support others to turn up with an intention to play their part? And then the us is recognising this systemic view, the world in layers, that turning up doesn't just happen in individuals, it can also happen in teams. Teams can have policy decisions. A policy decision is something, we've talked about and discussed as a team, and we have agreed to. And there's all kinds of agreements that teams can make that reduce their carbon footprint, that reduce their social and ecological footprint of harm. But also there's this idea of the footprint of harm, but also the handprint of benefit. We can say that we're turning away from that as a team, and we're turning towards that. We're turning towards seeing if there's ways we can bring benefit. And then that can happen at the level of organisations. How can we as an organisation turn away from causing harm? How can we really feel that we're turning up as a contributor in this time of danger rather than as one of the factors that's actually taking us over the edge of a cliff? And how can we turn towards something that is that idea of the beautiful act, the beautiful life? As an organisation, we do something that's good for the organisation, but also good for the world. This is the challenge of our time. How do we take part in this larger turning process, this great turning? But at each level, me, you and us, there's turning up with an intention to play our part, and the rest follows from that.
What comes up for me hearing you speak, Chris, is a deep sense of gratitude that you're on our team in this challenge, and that we could benefit as coaches. We can benefit from all of the wonderful experience and knowledge you bring, both from your work in resilience and addiction, but also that sense and the work that you've co-created with Joanna Macy, and a sense of bringing the heart into the conversation, and I hugely admire and forever will be grateful for all the work that you've done in helping all of us, but especially through my work as a coach, helping us connect with our hearts a bit more and help our clients connect with their hearts and lead from there.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. What comes up for me is that word flow. How can we be part of a flow that we have our heart in? And I'm also echoing your gratitude and thinking all of those I've received from, I've learnt from, I've experienced support and solidarity from. And this thing about flow is, it's kind of like, well, what is the flow that I want to happen through me? What do I want to be part of? If there's a flow of a movement in a direction, how do I help that happen more? And so I want to thank you too, George, because I feel like you're part of this flow too. You know, you're seeking out, you're taking in, you're chewing over, and you're passing on. And we can all do that. We can all play a role in that. And that's how ideas can spread, and practices can spread, and change can happen.
Well, Chris, it's an honour to be part of the Great Turning with you. And as we bring our conversation to a close today, what would be a good way for our listeners to follow your work or stay connected with you?
So the book Active Hope has just come out in a second edition, and Joanna Macy, who's 93, amazing woman, who I've learnt so much from, so grateful to, and we work very hard on how to make it address the very difficult challenges we face now, which are different from a decade ago. And so I'd recommend that, the book Active Hope, the second edition, and it has a different subtitle. The subtitle is How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power. What I'd also recommend is people find company to read the book with. And maybe even it's just meeting up and having a conversation about it from time to time. But also the book contains practices, and activehope.training. So activehope.info is a website about the book and about Active Hope more generally, activehope.info. But we've also got at activehope.training a free video-based online course. There's about 9 hours of material there that's released in weekly episodes over a 7-week period that guides people through some of the material in the book. You can do it with the book or instead of the book. It's completely free. But also we found that when people watch that course in company and do some of the practices that it introduces, we've had an outcome study of group have been through that, something like 130 people who've been through that program and have felt significantly strengthened in their motivation to act for positive change, and also in their belief that they can make a difference, and feeling less overwhelmed by their concerns for the world, strengthened in their feeling of connection with our world, but also feeling nourished by their experience of taking part in the course. So I'd recommend that to people too. And also coming up soon, the AC, Association for Coaching, have got a webinar series that I'm leading called How to Face the Mess We're In, a toolkit for transformative resilience, a transformational resilience. And so just look at the AC website for that. It begins in early October and runs over 4 Tuesday sessions.
Thank you, Chris. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you so much to our listeners and to you for being part of this conversation today.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Association for Coaching. Discover more business and coaching resources, thought leadership, and online learning at associationforcoaching.com.